Welcome, everyone. My name is Robert Brenner. I want to introduce today's session of the annual colloquium series of the Center for Social Theory and Comparative History. We have the longest title of any in the world that our institution, and this session is titled Authoritarianism in the World's Largest Democracy. Before I go on to introduce the session, I want to announce that 2 weeks from now, that is February 28th, we'll be having a comparative panel on Southeast Asia and Latin America with Dan Slater, Alfred Saad-Philo, and Julia Buxton, with UCLA's own Barbara Geddes as the discussant. This is the third panel in our winter 2022 series on the political economy of rising authoritarianism. Our previous panels examined the Middle East and China, and today we'll be examining the emergence of authoritarianism in India. India is known as the world's largest democracy, but the country has witnessed significant democratic backsliding over the past decade, especially following the victory of the Hindu nationalist BJP in 2014. The BJP is challenging some of the nation's defining political traits, such as secularism, at both the state and civil society level, and it continues to undercut important state institutions, such as the Election Commission. Our panelists are going to consider what an analysis of India's rapidly changing political economy, its developmental history, and its relationship with the global economy can tell us about its current predicament of increasing authoritarianism. We have two presenters and a discussant, and I would like to do the introductions now. So our first presenter is Pranab Bardhan, who is professor in the Department of Economics at UC Berkeley. Pranab is one of the world's leading developmental economists and has produced numerous studies on rural institutions in poor countries, on the political economy of developmental policy, and on international trade. His current research is on decentralized government and the political economy of development in China and India. Our second presenter is Jayati Ghosh, who is professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. Her research interests include globalization, international trade and finance, employment patterns, macroeconomic policy, gender issues, poverty, and equality. She has authored and edited a dozen books and more than 180 scholarly articles, most recently, Demonetization Decoded, a critique of India's monetary experiment. Our discussant will be John Harris, who's professor emeritus in international studies at Simon Fraser University. Professor Harris has a long history of research on India, particularly in Tamil Nadu, and has written or edited more than 10 books on the subject. His areas of interest include the political economy of development, politics, social policy, and agrarian change in India. So we're going to go directly to the presenters. After the presentation, we will have a Q&A, which will be run by Rohan Advani, the center administrator, and Rohan will basically take over from now following the presentations. So Pranab, take it from here.
Bob, thank you, Bob. That's a great opportunity for me to address all of you in this peculiar way, of course, but we are now used to it. I'm going to start not with India, but a bit of global perspective, because authoritarian right-wing populism is all over the world. And in fact, I'm going to start with some features of the global rise of authoritarian populism, right-wing populism, some features which are common with India and some features which are not. So that's why I'm starting with the global. And of course, we all know, not just in the United States under Trump, Britain under Brexit, and all over Europe, right-wing populism is has been quite rampant. Marine Le Pen in France, this extreme right-wing party, ADF in Germany, and then for developing countries in Turkey, Erdogan, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Duterte in Philippines, and of course, Modi in India. Now, I've noticed often that simultaneously in this period, many countries had grotesque rise in inequality. So quite often people put these things together. I personally think that even though inequality has gone up in many countries, not all, many countries, the direct connection between that and the rise of right-wing authoritarian populism is probably not that clear. In fact, in the rise of inequality has been relatively modest in Europe. It's been grotesque in the United States and some other countries, but it's relatively in large parts of Europe. In fact, which many people don't appreciate, that Brexit Britain, it happened when income inequality was declining in Britain. In fact, if you look at the data from around 2005 onward until today, if you look at the curve, it's declining in Britain. So connection is not direct. And the other thing to note is that the working classes who are angry sometimes with the traditional politicians, either of center left or center right, are rallying to the banners of some billionaires. Trump is not the only billionaire. The Nigel Farage, the originator of the Brexit movement, owns hundreds of millions of dollars. Marine Le Pen is hundreds of millions. I've looked at their asset characteristics, hundreds of millions of dollars. Orban is a billionaire, Putin is a billionaire, Erdogan is a billionaire. So the working classes are migrating, rallying to the banner of the top 1% is not the right way, but running to the banner is even top 1.1%. And I personally think inequality is very important, but more than inequality, or at least as much as inequality, it's insecurity. That's what is driving many people. I don't have time to go into this in detail, but if anyone is interested, I've actually just finished a book on this. It's going to come out from Harvard University Press. By September, it should be available. Its title is, it's for the global context. Its title is, what is it? It's called, A World of Insecurity, Democratic Disenchantment in Rich and Poor Countries. That's the title of the book. So that's a bit of commercial there for you. Now, insecurity, I'm going to focus on insecurity. Insecurity of two kinds. One is economic insecurity, the other is cultural insecurity. Economic insecurity is obvious: jobs and income losses, severe unemployment and underemployment in many countries. United States went through a big China shock, and there are now statistical studies which show areas where China shock has been severe in terms of jobs. Trump support is the most. Statistical relation is quite significant. But to me, the most important question is things like job and income losses, unemployment, underemployment. These are traditional left-wing issues. Why are the working classes turning right rather than left, faced with these economic insecurity issues? To me, that is the major question to answer. Now, in my book, I've gone a great deal into this, but let me mention 3 or 4 factors. And you will see then, I'm going to follow this up in the context of India. Number 1 is that outside the United States, many of these right-wing parties are not against the welfare state. Marine Le Pen in France is very much in support of the welfare state. In the AfD in Germany, the extreme right-wing party is very much in support of the right-wing of the welfare state. In fact, in Poland, which is a Catholic nationalist party, right-wing Catholic nationalist party, is very big on child care, child assistance programs. Erdogan, one of his striking achievements have been in trying to expand universal healthcare, and so on. So they're not, so in a sense, they're neutralized the strength of the left in terms of provision of welfare state. Second factor, which I think probably is more important, is that economic insecurity is only one part of the total insecurity. It's the cultural insecurity that is at least as important. And what do I mean by cultural insecurity? Some parties, a kind of status anxiety, what the position they had in the cultural social world, they're in danger. They think, in their perception, they might lose that. But also other cultural issues like immigration, which of course is a very big issue in Europe. In the United States, the economic insecurity is very important, but particularly because the welfare state, the safety net is patchy in the United States. But in Europe, where the safety net is not that patchy, Western Europe, that patchy cultural immigration kind of issues become very important. A third factor, and I'm going to go into all of this in the context of India. The third factor is social media. Now you might say, well, the left is quite active in social media too. Yes, that is true. But the right has a built-in advantage in social media. It's because, and now it's documentary evidence, there's a lot of statistical studies showing this, that fake news and lies spread much faster in social media. Conspiracy theories spread much faster. And the more outrageous it is, the speed with which it spreads is even more. And that's why I think the right has an inherent advantage in the social media in this respect. And here, since I'm soon going to go to India on many of these issues, let me read out to you a quotation from a speech given by Mr. Amit Shah, who's currently the Home Minister, but the speech is from 2018, when he used to be the head of BJP. And this is his boastful talk about to a group of his party's social media volunteers in 2018. And I quote, "We are capable of delivering any message we want to the public, whether sweet or sour, true or fake. We can do this because of our WhatsApp groups. That is how we are able to make this viral." This is a boastful statement by him in front of his party's IT cell people. Now, Facebook and WhatsApp, since they cannot operate in China, the largest clientele they have is in India. And there's already done tremendous amount of damage. Facebook, I can say that Facebook is complicit in murders and riots in India, which many of you may be already aware of. The fourth factor, before I go much more into India, the fourth factor has to do with trade unions. Earlier, in many countries, trade unions, among other roles, one major role they played was in taming the nativist passions of the working class. And now that for various reasons, trade unions are in decline, that role, there is a cultural void there. And that cultural void is being filled in by these right-wing demagogues. Now, going more properly into Indian details now, I'm going to, so this will serve as a background for you in terms of the different features. First, inequality. Inequality, I have always maintained this for the last few decades since I have worked on Indian income distribution, poverty distribution data. India is one of the world's largest, highest unequal countries, and that's been clear to me for a long time. But one problem is that India does not collect income distribution data, officially, no income distribution data. India does collect wealth inequality data every about 10-year intervals. By the way, my friend Thomas Piketty has this World Inequality Report that comes out every year. I'm not fully comfortable with it. By the way, they don't collect any data themselves. It's Government of India data, which then they project year to year. Government of India data comes out at periodic intervals, like 10-year intervals in some cases, 5-year intervals in some others. But what Piketty's group does in the World Inequality Report takes the government data, it's not their data, takes the government data and then extrapolates it. So in that sense, it's not real data, it's synthetic data. But if you want to discuss data in question and answer, I'll be happy to answer. But in spite of data scarcity, I'm quite prepared to believe inequality has gone up, particularly wealth inequality has gone up in a big way in India. And that's household inequality. What about corporate sector inequality? We have some evidence that corporate concentration has increased tremendously. I'll just give you one figure. If you take the 20 most profitable companies in India, in 1990, they contributed 10% of total corporate profits. In 2010, they contributed 30% of total corporate profits. In 2019, just before the pandemic, in 9 years, from 30% of total profits, it jumped to 70% of total profits. It's a symptom of the tremendous corporate concentration. And of course, it's India, I think it's probably correct to describe India as a crony capitalist oligarchy. And there is a quid pro quo relation between the state and this crony oligarchy. The crony oligarchy contributes to the ruling party coffers through this interesting system they have introduced now. It's essentially a con game of electoral bonds. The overwhelming majority of these funds go to the ruling party. And there's a quid pro quo. Essentially, the government gives these cronies regulatory favors and other advantages. But again, going back to the question that I raised before in the global context, if you talk to the average voter for Modi in India, they're not bothered very much. They don't raise that rise in inequality or corporate concentration issue. The average voter is much more worried about unemployment, much more worried about job losses, is the economic insecurity that I mentioned before. In fact, in 2014, that was the major promise on which Modi came to power, namely he will provide what he said, 20 million jobs and so on. And there, I think there's an interesting difference between India and much of the world. And that is, in much of the Western world, at least, the average voter for the right-wing populists is more rural, older, less educated. That is not the case in India. In India, Modi appealed to the aspirational youth of India. And of course, India being a much younger country than the West, that makes a big, big difference if the aspirational youth goes for you. It's also interesting in the voting pattern. In India, in the United States, the major metropolitan cities vote Democrat. Even Turkey, for Erdogan voters, Erdogan loses in Istanbul, in Ankara, and other metropolitan cities. In India, the major metropolitan cities in national elections vote for Modi. Delhi, Mumbai included, but some others too. So there's a big difference there that Modi has appealed to the aspirational youth, urban youth, quite often. Let me now go to the issue of the welfare state issue that I mentioned before. Of course, India is not a welfare state, but India has some welfare policies. Modi has not dismantled, in spite of a lot of talk before, has not dismantled the employment guarantee program, the food distribution program, and the urban housing program that the earlier governments had. But one difference, earlier government, at least in rhetoric, used this as a right to food, right to jobs, etc. But now they come openly as gifts from Mr. Modi. In fact, sometimes along with his photograph. On top of these three programs that I mentioned, he has also introduced some other programs, the most important of which, in terms of electorally, was the cooking gas, making available cooking gas to a significant number of poor groups, and the second program, which is getting them toilets. And the third program is is already started becoming important, but I think in the 2024 election, it will be, I can tell you, this is going to be a big thing. And that is, he's promised tapped water on the tap, Nal Se Jal, is for all over India. And I can tell you 2024 election will be very big. It's already in some parts of India, it's making some difference. Now, in all these programs, I can tell you problems with these programs, but that is not that important, because what is important is Modi and the party has succeeded in controlling the narrative. And they have the megaphone, they have the money, they're flush with the corporate money that I just told you. They have large number of volunteers from the RSS, which is the cultural organization that's behind Modi. And the third is, of course, Modi has tremendous oratorical skills. So they control the narrative. The opposition is nowhere near in terms of the narrative. And in this narrative, of course, then addresses the cultural insecurity that I'm going to talk about. But in a sense, some of this cultural insecurity is manufactured insecurity. They spread false victimhood for the Hindus, manufactured resentment, imaginary dangers of being overwhelmed, of being outnumbered. They will always talk about the Muslim fertility rate being higher. What they don't point out that in the educated parts of India, like in Kerala, the Muslim woman's fertility rate is much lower than Hindu woman's fertility rate in less educated Uttar Pradesh. But they will not point that out. They will say Muslim fertility, Hindu fertility. And even with that, most Hindus are 80% of the population. So with the higher fertility rate, to outnumber the Hindus will take hundreds and hundreds of years. But again, this is usual. By the way, even in Europe, this is happening. France, the right-wing intellectuals are talking about the great replacement, about the Muslims essentially outnumbering the Christian, the Catholic French people. In fact, this great replacement, there is a novel that I was reading the other day by Michel Houellebecq, one of the most important novelists of France. He has a novel called The Submission. I read the English version. It's The Submission, where he's the dystopian day of France becoming an Islamic republic. That's what it's about. So this is elsewhere, but in India, of course, through WhatsApp, it's become a big thing. Now, on top of and in general, Muslims are called traitors and terrorists. In a sense, it reminds me how the Israeli leaders sometimes used to use Palestinians and terrorists interchangeably. The BJP leaders sometimes do the same thing in India. And on top of this, to play up this cultural insecurity, there's a lot of political theater and religious spectacle. And this control of narrative works. And that it works, I'll give you two examples. That works even with the opposition parties. So the opposition parties are always afraid they will be branded as pro-Muslim, and they're afraid about that. So look at the current election that's going on in India's largest state, Uttar Pradesh, which, by the way, has a population larger than Brazil. In Uttar Pradesh, Muslim constitute 19% of the population. If you look at the number of Muslim candidates, put up, forget about BJP, put up by people who are fighting BJP, very few Muslims, because they're afraid, the opposition parties are afraid, the major opposition parties, I'm not talking about the Muslim parties, major opposition parties have put up very few Muslim candidates. They're afraid they will be called pro-Muslim. Similarly, when 2019, August 2019, Kashmir's autonomy, whatever little autonomy they had, and dignity were trampled upon by this bifurcation of that state, very few national opposition parties protested, or they were very subdued protests. Because again, if you support vehemently the Kashmiris, then you will be branded as pro-Muslim. So the narrative is completely controlled by the BJP, and the opposition is afraid that is correct. But it's not just the Muslims. I think it's important also to look at the electoral behavior of Dalits of India. If you study the election studies in the statistics, 35 to 40% of Dalits in the 2019 national election have voted for Modi. This is a party, BJP, the ideology is one of authoritarian communalism, but also essentially the ideology is suffused with Brahminical ideology, upper caste ideology, and it's being accepted by the very significant number of Dalits are voting for them. In fact, I was reading the other day an account which is really alarming in some sense, but also you can it was quite convincing to me that for many decades at the ground level, quietly, the RSS volunteers have been working on something which is very important for the Dalits. The RSS volunteers are trying to quietly incorporate iconic gods and historic leaders of Dalits and tribals, the Adivasis, the indigenous people. They have been appropriating those gods and historical leaders and bringing them under the broad Hindu tent. So this has contributed at the ground level to a lot of ground of Hindu consolidation. On top of that, the other thing, and this is Amit Shah's specialty, what he does, he crafts tactical alliances of different, even Dalit groups, the other backward class groups, or tribal groups. So just to give you an example, in UP, in the last election, 2017 election, Mayawati, who is the leader of, a major leader of the Dalits, Amit Shah calculated that yes, she may be a major leader of the Dalits, but only one part of Dalits. And the caste group which votes for Mayawati is called Jatav. So Amit Shah organized the non-Jatav Dalits, majority of whom voted for BJP. So this all over India, this is happening. Very clever crafting of tactical alliances, even among backward castes, even among Dalits, even among tribals. So a significant proportion population votes for them. In fact, I was looking at the data in a recent West Bengal election, which BJP lost tremendously. But look at the voting pattern of the Dalits. Some of the major Dalit group, one is a Matua group in eastern part of West Bengal. Another is called Rajbansi group, which is in the northern part of West Bengal. They majority voted for BJP. So these kind of alliances all over India played a very important role. Let me now essentially go to issues of what to look at the future. Unfortunately, to me, I'm a pessimistic type. I'm not very optimistic about this. But what particularly disheartens me is the behavior of various civil society organizations. Not to speak of media. Media is bought by those corporate magnates and plus intimidated. Bureaucracy is servile. Election Commission, which is a part of the Constitution, is behaving in a servile way. And then the courts. Courts are timid, courts are erratic, and the courts are compromised sometimes. So just faulting Modi is not enough. I think we are all to blame. The whole of the opinion-making groups in India, with very microscopic exceptions, are complicit in all this. And you see this, the narrative being won by BJP. You see, I read reports, press reporters talking to Dalits, talking to tribals. What do they respond? So let me just tell you one report that I was receiving. I can give you many examples. Let me cite just one example. In the UP election, a reporter goes and talks to a young man. Who do you support? He, of course, immediately says, Modi. He said, the reporter then said, Modi promised you jobs in 2014. Do you have a job? He said, no. He said, then why do you still support Modi? His answer was, but Modi is making India great. This is like Trump's making America great. Modi's Indians great. All the other countries now respect India. They didn't earlier before, but they respect India. A pathetic interview that I read in 2020, when Modi is completely uncalled for drastic lockdown without giving only 4 hours notice. By the way, same 24 March, same day, South Africa announced lockdown, but South African leaders gave 4 days time to adjust. India got only 4 hours. So you had these migrant laborers walking hundreds of miles, no arrangement for their transport. So I was reading a report of a migrant worker who is trudging wearily to the village in UP, hundreds of miles. Press person asked, so what do you think of Modi? He says, no. This is no fault of Mr. Modi. This is, COVID is God-given nature, etc. So I think the narrative is entirely the hands of the BJP. And that's what is important. And let me end with two things, looking to the future. A lot of my friends take a lot of hope from the way the farmers won the victory recently, the farmers' movement. I'm also cheered by that, but I think one should not exaggerate what to derive from that. Even though the rest of India's farmers were with the farmers' movement, that was only a rhetorical support, because the farmers' movement, the North Indian farmers, Punjab, Haryana, and Western Uttar Pradesh farmers, their issues are quite different from the issues in rest of India farmers. On agricultural marketing, issues of North India are quite different. If necessary, I can go into that in question answer, quite different. So I have a fear that if BJP loses UP election, I would not be surprised very soon, or at least before the 2024 national election, they will take up some of the demands of the North Indian farmers, like minimum support price, etc. Minimum support price, even if they announce for those three crops, wheat, paddy, and sugarcane, is not going to help the rest of India. And in fact, it will hurt the environment in North India. But Modi, I think, will just accept at that time and win the farmers over. I think the rest of India's farmers require a completely different kind of reform in agricultural marketing, but those will not be addressed, etc. So yes, I'm glad that the farmers won, but I'm not very hopeful that I don't have exaggerated hopes about looking to the future. It's very interesting that the labor reform, so-called reform that the government has brought out, yet you don't see that much of labor protest. Yes, rhetorical protest, but in terms comparable to the farmers' movement, you don't see, at least so far, a labor movement of that kind, partly because the number of organized sector labor are much smaller than the number of farmers. I think the main resistance, and this is where I'm going to end, the main resistance that's going to come will be regional. And this is partly because this government is wrecking the federal structure of India. And I could go into details in various ways. Even in a short span of years, it's wrecked a very large part of the Indian federal structure. And this is going to hurt the many regional governments. Because the problem is the regional governments are not united on this. They should be united. And also in some regions, Assam is with BJP, in Karnataka is with BJP. But in general, I would think in East and South, the regional protest will be more important over time. And that's in a country of India's diversity, regional diversity, that narrative will not be easy for Modi to control unless he goes for something that he went for the 2019 election, namely a national security alarm at the time of election. That's how he won 2019, partly. But it is difficult to cry wolf every time. So this may not work every time. The other is, of course, Modi's image, which he cultivates, is that India is in this country of extreme diversity and fragmentation, and he's the one who's above all this. Is this narrative that for national unity and somebody who's above all the fragmentation, this sage-like leader, go for him. That's the narrative they will try to control. But I think this may not work. But one doesn't know what national election. The voter votes differently in the regional election and national election. So they may still get away with the national election 2024, but how long they're going on wrecking the federal structure, they can go on, I'm not sure. So that's my hope essentially is on in the diversity, regional resilience kind of point of view. Let me stop there. Thanks.
Okay, thanks so much, Professor Bardhan. We'll move to Professor Ghosh now.
Thank you very much also for inviting me to this. And I have to say, I agree with most of what Professor Bardhan has already said. And since he has spoken at some length, I'm going to keep it brief so we get some more time for discussion. I would like to place this, if you like, within the broader political economy of Indian development and look at it also within what I see as a broader contradiction, which is actually a global contradiction between neoliberalism and democracy in general. So yes, the Modi regime is qualitatively different and it's unusual even globally, and it has very specific characteristics, which I think Professor Bardhan has highlighted in great detail. But there was a tension already in the Indian political economy with the fact of the pattern of development, which supposedly generated very rapid growth over the past 2-3 decades without generating major structural transformation. We didn't move people out of low productivity activities in agriculture and services into higher value-added activities. We didn't generate the kind of employment generation that is expected or assumed to happen with the kind of GDP growth that we had. In fact, remarkably, we find between 2011-12 and 2017-18, which is when we have the aggregate employment data, employment is estimated to have fallen. Aggregate employment is estimated to have fallen by about 9 million people, largely women, and largely in informal activities. Formal employment, even throughout this period of the 30 years, has been largely flat. It hasn't really increased. So there is a fundamental issue. It's not increased insecurity so much as the fact that, you know, it's a very insecure labor market and has remained insecure. 95% of our workers do not have formal jobs. They do not get any of the benefits of formality in that sense. Some of them are registered under various schemes, but that's very little in terms of basic formal legal protection. We also have very little social protection. And this, again, it's something historical. We have very little in terms of social policy, again, historical. So in a sense, this is the context in which the authoritarian tendencies have emerged. What's, I would argue, different in India is that, yes, these tendencies emerged by focusing on the aspirational. And that's, I think, very important to note. The BJP and Mr. Modi himself throughout from in 2014 and 2019, he has not been talking about redistribution. The orientation is never redistributive. It is always aspirational. You too can be rich. I will make India great. I will double farmers' incomes. I will generate 20 million jobs for the youth. I will make sure you have access to the best available of whatever it is. So it is always about aspiration. However, what's remarkable, and I think this is really the fascinating thing about India over the last 8 years, is that despite pretty much failing on all the aspirations, pretty much not meeting any of the promises that were made earlier on and continue to be made, the popularity, as Professor Bardhan has been mentioned, is largely, I won't say unchanged, but it's not diminished as one would expect. And the things that earlier governments were held accountable for, that you did not deliver on X and Y, or the things that state governments are regularly held accountable for, those don't seem to matter to the same extent. So I think one question is, what's going on? Why is it that this particular brand of Hindutvavadi or very religious oriented authoritarianism combined with lack of delivery, how come that works? And what is it then what are the sources of contradiction in this political economy? So I think Professor Bardhan is absolutely right. There are some central elements of the success. The control of narrative is a very important part of that success. And yes, it's absolutely true that mainstream media is completely out there in not just support, but cheerleading and almost cringe-makingly subservient to the ruling party and to the leadership. But it's not just that. I think it's the fact that large capital, crony capital in India is very firmly with Mr. Modi and remains very firmly with Mr. Modi. I think that's quite different from, let us say, authoritarian tendencies in different parts of the world where you have elements of capital also objecting. This too is a bit of a surprise for some reasons. Now, it's absolutely true what Professor Bardhan said, that the large capital has benefited disproportionately, the share of corporate profits, which, by the way, got even worse during the pandemic. The pandemic year, you find that the top 10% of companies have got 90% of profits. In a period when micro, small, and medium enterprises have been decimated, where mid-cap and small-cap companies are also performing very poorly, and many of them are actually forced to close down and so on. Certain large capital, particularly crony capital, has been extraordinarily profitable. And of course, we've had one of the chief cronies, Mr. Adani, Gautam Adani, who was a creation of the Modi government in Gujarat and then subsequently at national level, jumping to 6th position in the richest men of the world from, I think he was 36 or something, and his wealth has gone up by, I think, 8 times or 18 times or some extraordinary amount just during the pandemic period. So yes, there is a small group of large capital that is very firmly behind Mr. Modi and is also very firmly benefiting from the various things that are being granted to them by the regime. And these operate in all kinds of ways. The electoral bonds, of course, serves as a form of organized bribery or corruption that enable companies to pay into the BJP's coffers without being identified, and by then getting benefits in return. And of course, benefits are accruing to those specific cronies independently as well. They are now also entering into a new range of digital technologies, into a new range of of the green technologies, which are also being taken over by some of the important cronies in the attempt to combine nationalism with specific, very, very oligarchic capitalism. But there are, as Professor Bardhan mentioned, there are contradictions in this, and I would identify several. So, as I said, this is in the backdrop of a fundamental contradiction between neoliberalism and democracy. And one of the ways this expressed itself even before the BJP government, the Modi government came to power, was in the nature of the boom that India experienced. Everybody talked about how India was this emerging economy and it had all this great development potential, and it was like China, one of the beneficiaries of globalization and so on, all on the basis of about 8 or 9 years of very rapid growth. When I say very rapid, I say between 7 and 10% per annum. In the period between broadly 2002 and 2011, this is the period of the rapid growth. But when you look down at this, you break it down, it's really a very limited sources of that growth. One part of it is the entry of finance capital that enables a dramatic expansion in credit-based consumption and investment of a very limited part of the economy, and that generates a particular type of growth. And the other is extractivist. The other is based on dramatically deregulated environment for extractivist industries, whether it is coal or aluminum or metals of different kinds, or even spectrum. I mean, in other words, it was the extractive industries combined with the dramatic inflow of finance that enabled a credit-fueled boom for Indian elites, middle classes, and a certain category of investors that gave us those very rapid rates of growth. So it's not surprising they didn't generate more employment, et cetera, et cetera. It was a frustration with that and the anger at the perceived beneficiaries of that growth, which gave us Mr. Modi, gave us the BJP in power. Of course, not discounting the significant role played by decades of work by the RSS on the ground in different parts of the country, the gradual and deep penetration of communal thinking and ideologies among people all over the country, in all kinds of unexpected areas, even in the South and so on. All of that was true, but it was really that dissatisfaction. 8 years down the road, you don't have any major change in those economic conditions. You have, in fact, a worsening of these economic conditions. And yet you have a deepening of that communal ideology. You have a greater willingness to bear with authoritarianism, which would not have been allowed to the same degree at all in the earlier regime. And you have an ability, which I think Professor Bardhan highlighted very well in a lot of detail, to utilize existing fissures and divisions, by caste, by religious category, and so on, to enable continued electoral victories. Even so, I would argue it is surprising. And it's surprising at different levels because there are new contradictions being exposed. So one contradiction is between Hindutva itself and neoliberal capitalism. At one level, it seems that they are antithetical, because here you have not just a very backward-looking revanchist kind of ideology, but one that actually inhibits a lot of economic production. The worship of the cow and the attack on all the cow-related industries, whether it is beef exports. India was one of the largest beef exporters in the world, believe it or not, until relatively recently. The textile and, the leather industry and the footwear industry, all really destroyed by this attempt to attack the cattle trade, to prohibit beef exports, to attack anyone associated with the cattle trade in general, which not only impacts these very largely employment-intensive activities, but it also affects agriculture, because farmers now find it's unfeasible to hold cows when they're no longer able to produce milk or to be active on the farms, and so they release them. And then they're out there basically marauding and foraging on the fields and creating difficulties for farmers themselves. And it has become a significant issue, including in the North Indian plains where the elections are being held and so on. So there is a contradiction, if you like, in terms of how capitalist markets work and that particular aim. There is a contradiction in terms of the ways in which labor markets function. Now, India has always relied on heavily segmented labor markets, deeply segmented by caste, segmented massively by gender, segmented by community, to enable particular types of extreme exploitation. And that has, I would argue, operated against a wider spread of capitalist investment, simply because it enables much more of this sort of absolute exploitation and creates less incentives for, if you like, the more virtuous productivity increasing paths of investment. And it enables a modern or 21st century sector, whether it is IT or anything else, that exists on the basis of the subsidies provided by the unpaid labor of women and the underpaid labor of lower castes, marginalized groups of different kinds, different religions, and so on, all of which subsidize that formal economy. So it has always had that particular pattern. What we're getting now, though, is a slightly different situation. As employment conditions worsen, and of course the pandemic meant an absolute devastation of livelihood possibilities. So as we get that dramatic decline in employment conditions and in possibilities of work and so on, you are also getting less possibilities even for that earlier subsidized group, even for the earlier beneficiaries of that neoliberal possibility, and therefore the range of aspiration is shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. One of the interesting features of the period of the boom was the rise of the small towns, of the emergence of new employment opportunities and new aspirational people even in the small towns. All of those are now shrinking. We are getting shrinking labor markets, I think, at a rate unparalleled anywhere else in the world. We're getting declining employment opportunities, falling livelihoods of those who still have some kinds of income generating work at dramatically increasing rates. I don't believe this can happen indefinitely. Now, I'm not being sort of crudely materialist determinist, I hope, in this case, but I do believe that processes like these have limits. They generate social tensions of different kinds. You cannot contain it only by creating religious polarization. Yes, you can do it significantly for a while, but you cannot do it indefinitely. And within religion, then you'd have to work towards other kinds of polarization, increase the caste polarizations, increase the gender polarizations or something. You'd have to keep adding to those, and those do not play into the national narrative that is sought to be created about making India great globally and in general, and harking back to this wonderful primordial past in which the Hindu male, essentially, the Hindu upper caste male was actually this great global kind of icon. So the first contradiction in that sense, I would argue, is that you're continuing on a neoliberal path that doesn't generate employment, doesn't enable employment diversification, doesn't provide the aspirations that you have promised to meet, okay? And let's face it, the fascists of the past, they created employment. I mean, Hitler, Mussolini, they were all creating employment. They really did enable that kind of diversification. We don't find that in India. I do believe that's a very major contradiction that will have to play out. The other contradiction is something that Professor Bardhan mentioned towards the very end. That is the centralization of this Indian state compared to the impossibility of that in what has to be a federal system like India. The Modi government has been centralizing beyond belief in all kinds of ways, whether it is in terms of grabbing more and more tax revenues through ways that don't have to be shared with the states in the form of cesses and other surcharges and so on, whether it is in the form of reneging on its own commitment to provide a minimum compensation to states for taking on or agreeing to a general goods and services tax, in which the states lost revenue raising powers, and the government had promised them 14% increase in revenues every year, or they would compensate the difference, and they simply stopped doing it. They just said, we won't do it. Oh, now it's the pandemic, we can't do it, etc. We'll allow you to take back-to-back loans instead, rather than give what we had promised you. Whether it is in the form of announcing a nationwide lockdown that Professor Bardhan mentioned with 4 hours notice, without consulting the state governments, without even mentioning it to them. It came as news to everybody when he announces it on television. Announcing a nationwide lockdown using the National Disaster Management Act, which gives complete centralized powers to the Prime Minister, and then leaving the whole baby to be borne by the state governments, not doing anything in terms of either compensation or implementation or anything. All of this then left to state governments to handle. Whether in terms of, throughout the pandemic, the range of measures that were centralized, while in fact the actual work that had to be done still had to be done by state governments. Now, all of this has created massive tensions. We have never seen such tensions between center and state. And my information is that even BJP governments, state governments, are deeply unhappy. The NREGA, which the Employment Guarantee Act, which Mr. Modi had first derided and was then eventually forced to continue, has been completely underfunded. Even in these massive increase, supposedly massive increase, was still less than half of what was required during the pandemic, and the allocation has been brought down to the year before's allocation now, even though rural distress is massive. State governments are in deficit. They have spent money that they haven't got back yet. They are desperate. At least 11 chief ministers have written demanding more money, which they are by law required to provide, and it's not being provided. So in other words, there are so many different tensions of the center state level, economic, political, in every possible way, that you cannot sustain that beyond a point. So I think absolutely the second huge contradiction is between center and states. It can go in a very disastrous direction. It could actually, the worst case scenario would be some kind of breakup, some kind of fissiparous tendencies that actually create the possibility of the breakup of the Indian Union, that absolute worst case scenario. But even before that, you would get many different kinds of tensions, which would be hard for a government like the Modi government to actually deal with over time. Then there is the issue of, the religious polarization. I think I've already talked about how that creates difficulties in terms of the the economic functioning beyond a point. It's not just that you have 20%, 24% Muslims in your entire population. It is also that there are aspects of the economy that rely hugely on them. You cannot keep destroying that. You cannot, yes, you can use riots, you can use religious disharmony, etc., to displace people, to deny them their livelihood, and to take over that land, the assets, and those activities. But over time, there are limits to that as well. And there I would argue that the other deep contradiction I see comes from this fact, the overall fact that we know consumption is falling. We know that the consumption of the bottom half has been falling now for more than a decade, but post-pandemic, it's absolutely collapsing. And we know that the concentration even within industry has increased very sharply, even during the pandemic. So you have the classic prey-predator relationship problem. If the predator eats too much of the prey, that at some point the predator also starves. We are getting to that point in the Indian economy where the prey-predator relationship has become, if you like, a bit dysfunctional. It's a bit unviable. You can keep swallowing up, but even if the top cronies get a larger share of a shrinking pie, at some point it's not worth it even for them. So given all of that, given all of these, what I see is really very, very large contradictions. The question is, how long can an authoritarian government operate on the basis of suppressing dissent in this way? So yes, the Modi government provides some welfare, so-called, very, very limited. I mean, in fact, it was the least welfare provided among any of the G20 countries and most middle-income countries in the pandemic period. It was the least welfare, but nonetheless, it provides some, and it advertises it hugely. The names are on the vaccine. Mr. Modi's face is on the vaccine certificate. His face is on the food grain packets that are distributed, and so on. So yes, there's a lot of advertising of whatever little is provided. But I don't believe that is enough. I mean, I wouldn't underplay the intelligence of Indian voters to that extent to say that just seeing that face is enough to persuade them that something more is being provided than they would see as their due in a broader scheme of things. So I also believe that, my old teacher in Cambridge, Joan Robinson, used to say that whatever you can say about India, the opposite is also true. And to some extent, that's true. Whenever I feel completely disheartened and pessimistic at the state of Indian media, I notice that there are things like The Wire, things like, Caravan, which are remarkable and still persist despite all odds. Media houses that tiny, but are disproportionately punching above their weight because they are read by all the political elite, including the ruling BJP and so on. Whenever I think of all the things that Professor Bardhan mentioned in terms of the inability of the opposition to get its act together and so on, I noticed that in the southern states, in some of the eastern states and so on, you really cannot assume that sort of Hindi belt narrative holds at all. Whenever I think of the deeply depressing ability, or the kinds of interviews that Professor Bardhan mentioned of the young people who say, despite everything else, I think of the fact that opinion polls regularly get it wrong because people are scared to say who they will actually vote for, or they don't want to come clean about it because they know that too much can be done to them if they announce intentions that are not with the ruling party, and that therefore electorates surprise us. And finally, I would say that, in India, change has rarely come from the direction that we were looking for it. And I've seen a lot of political change in my time, from the emergency to the end of the emergency and the unseating of Mrs. Gandhi to the emergence of the Janata Dal all kinds of changes have come, not from directions that we expect. So I'm not as pessimistic as Professor Bardhan on the future. I think it is a deeply depressing, terrifying time for India. I think the ability of this government to suppress dissent is not only because of its own shamelessness and ability to use all kinds of means, from imprisoning completely innocent human rights lawyers and workers and etc., to every possible means, using the enforcement directorate, IT, etc., to attack, to get after anyone who dissents and opposes. All of that is there. Yet the dissent continues. The farmers' movement is a very complex movement. The MSP is a demand that is publicly stated, etc., but it's not. They have a very long list of very carefully thought out demands, which includes land rights for farmers in tribal areas, which includes ecological policies that would make their farming more sustainable. So I think the farmers' movement also is a more intelligent and a much more complex movement. I think the students' movement is remarkable and very conscious of the possibilities that emerge. So I'm more hopeful. I think it's a terrible time, but it is even this shall pass, and it will pass. It will change often for factors that we weren't expecting or looking for. But let me stop here. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Ghosh. Now we'll turn to our discussant, Professor John Harris, for his remarks. We need you to unmute. Yeah. There you go.
Wow, that's quite a couple of presentations for me to follow. Two extraordinarily powerful analyses of trends in the political economy of India and of how these relate to the ascendancy of what I think is advisedly called authoritarian populism, or perhaps as by the VDEM report, an electoral autocracy in India. Do you know, isn't it really time we stopped parroting the description of India as the world's largest democracy? You know, call a spade a spade. It ain't the world's largest democracy anymore, I'm afraid. As I said, Jayati and Pranab are hard acts to follow, and there's very, very little, well, there's nothing really in their presentations with which I disagree. There is, though, a factor that I think that both speakers have, I feel, not given as much prominence or attention as I think I would have done. And that is actually the factor of the ideology of Hindu nationalism, which I think is an extraordinarily sort of powerful factor in the underpinning of this regime. Pranab, you actually have foot-faulted me in the sense that in the paper that you sent me before this seminar, I think there expressed a certain optimism towards the end of the paper when you doubted the long-term viability of what you called the poisonous mix of majoritarian nationalism and populism. And I'm not sure that I agree with that. Hindu nationalism has very deep historical roots, going back as far, I think, in the 19th century as those of the liberal nationalism articulated by the Congress. And it has an extraordinary foundation in the organization of the RSS, with its mass membership across much, if not quite all, of the country, and in the strength of the organizations that are associated with it. I think, for example, of the student organization, the ABVP, which has effectively closed down critical discussion across many university campuses, including, sadly, I think, Jayati, the campus of JNU. So, you know, I think this regime has very strong foundations, if you will, in Hindu nationalism. Maybe the results of these current state elections will prove my pessimism unfounded. What I think I'd like to do is to perhaps adumbrate some parts of the arguments we've heard, partly by developing a little bit more of an historical perspective. For me, there have been three crucial failures of the Indian state going back to the early years of the Republic that I think go a long way toward accounting for the establishment of this authoritarian populist regime. These are first, the failure to address the agrarian question in the 1940s and 1950s with the botched implementation of redistributive land reform, leaving the agricultural economy dominated by small landlords and rich peasants, and the mass of the rural people dependent on marginal holdings and agricultural labor. And secondly, relatedly, Jayati has spoken about the failure to manage economic development in such a way as to generate productive employment, instead effectively excluding a large share of the labor force from the modern economy. These failures account for what Jayati spoke of briefly, and both of our speakers have written of, in terms, I think, of India's abortive or aborted structural transformation. That labor has remained locked into relatively unproductive agriculture and precarious, informal, non-agricultural employment. And these are conditions, as Jayati has said, explained with such passion, that have got worse through the period of India's very high economic growth, and even more so in the context of the pandemic. The most important source of employment outside agriculture earlier this century was, of course, the construction industry. Latterly, I believe the movement out of agriculture has even gone into reverse, and employment in manufacturing has been declining. Aborted or abortive structural transformation bears on the long-running problem that Jayati referred to of the demand side in India's economic development, and that's been so much in evidence, or even more in evidence, in the context of the pandemic. For me, the third crucial failure, referred to really only if at all, in passing, perhaps by Jayati implicitly, the third crucial failure for me is that of public education. The commitment made in the Constitution to achieve universal basic education by 1960 has hardly been realized even now, in part, as the late Myron Weiner showed, because so many upper caste politicians and officials haven't really believed that their caste inferiors need it or deserve it. Basic literacy, I think, was still only 74% of the population, according to the census of 2011, lagging far, far behind levels in East and Southeast Asia. Enrollment in elementary education is now almost 100% for sure, but in rural India, certainly attendance is still much lower, and it's calculated that 70% of children fall far behind the level of accomplishment expected for their age grade. They miss out early on and never catch up. And this hugely important problem has been greatly accentuated in the pandemic. The hopes that India will be able to cash in on its so-called demographic dividend, I believe, are most unlikely to be realized. And of course, the lack of basic literacy hampers realization of the rights of citizenship for many, and probably makes them more susceptible to the manipulations of truth by the media. Accounting for the rise of authoritarian populism in India is for sure a more complex story. But I think that these three failures that I've highlighted have played a very important part in it. Now, the masses of aspirational, yes, but poorly educated, poorly employed young men, sometimes women too, supply the foot soldiers of the vigilantism and moral policing that's actively encouraged by the regime and that supplies much of the violence on which it rests. Vigilante groups protecting cows, for instance, as Jayati mentioned, or ostensibly the virtues of Hindu women, work with the blessing of the state and at the expense of the rule of law. The French scholar Christophe Jaffrelot goes so far as to describe India as being on the way to becoming a vigilante state. An example of such a state perhaps exists already in Uttar Pradesh under the leadership of the present chief minister, who's also a monk. The Republic of India set out with a constitution that laid out through what are called the directive principles, policy goals for what was in effect a social democratic agenda, including commitments to what we might call decent work and to the supply of critical public goods, including education and healthcare. But a significant body of research in comparative politics shows that programmatic political parties capable of delivering on such an agenda have generally become established historically only in contexts in which fundamental bureaucratic reforms have been accomplished before democratization. And this was not the case in India. Despite the mythology of the so-called steel frame of the colonial civil service, it was in practice deeply clientelistic. Public administration in the country is generally extremely poor, and efforts at bringing about reform, for example, in order to eliminate the ability of politicians to have to have bureaucrats transferred pretty much at will. Efforts at reform have been at best half-hearted. And where public administration is mistrusted and has a poor reputation, then a kind of vicious spiral is set in motion. If voters expect electoral promises to be implemented by a bureaucracy with a weak reputation, as is the case in India, then they don't find party platforms based on public goods provision credible, and politicians seeking election refrain from making promises to deliver such public goods. Instead, they're likely to make populist promises to deliver private goods and implicitly or explicitly to make promises of patronage, perhaps to people from a particular community. So clientelism becomes deeply entrenched. Indian democracy, I think, has always been such a brokered or mediated democracy in which the great majority of people are supplicants rather than citizens able to exercise their rights. This is the context in which politics has become a business, with more and more businessmen investing in their election to legislative bodies, and of course, looking for a return on those investments. The numbers of members of parliament with criminal records has increased steadily, and some research shows that such politicians are more likely to win re-election. It seems that being a boss appeals to voters because it suggests that as a politician, the person will have the ability to get stuff done for them. Given these politics, Narendra Modi's populist appeal as a man from a poor lower caste background, something which he's always projected quite strongly, standing as the embodiment really, rather than just the representative of the people against a corrupt and ineffectual old political elite, has proved very compelling. One of his great achievements, Pranab referred to this, has been to consolidate support among poor and lower caste people for a political party, the BJP, that is actually dominated by upper castes and even celebrates Brahmanism. This was true at the time of the 2014 election, and increasingly since then. Modi's been unafraid to polarize the people of India, drawing on the majoritarian claims of Hindus against Muslims and other minorities, and the ideology of Hindutva. Drawing too on or mobilizing the disaffection of the common people against so-called English thinking, an English thinking liberal elite that is dismissed as anti-national. Modi, as has been said, is a master storyteller with an utter disdain for truth. I think he showed that last week in Parliament, didn't he? When he claimed again that India has been an example to the world in the management of the COVID pandemic. I mean, what evidently utter nonsense that claim is. Modi's India exhibits very clearly what one writer recently has referred to as the 3 Ps that underlie the surge of authoritarianism across the world: populism, polarization, and post-truth. But as both speakers have said, what's been so striking has been Modi's ability to command the narrative. Even the appalling suffering, caused by the way the government has mishandled the pandemic. In spite of that, there's good reason, as you've said, for thinking that very many Indians still believe the story that it was all done to save lives and to make an increasingly self-reliant India greater than ever. A significant reason for support the ruling party has won electorally has to do with the success of the government in the public delivery of private welfare goods, the gas cylinders that were referred to, toilets, houses, electricity, the clean tap water that Pranab spoke of, as well as bank accounts. These are so much easier to deliver than our good public education and public health care, in which, as we saw in the budget announced 10 days or so ago, the government continues to invest at levels that are way below what even official bodies have regularly argued to be necessary. Well, as we've said, it remains to be seen how durable this regime based on the 3 Ps and secured by shrewd but cynical welfare spending, as well as by the performance, which is what it has been, of defending the security of the nation, will prove. The success of the farmers' movement, the farmers' protests in getting the government to backtrack on its proposed new policies for agricultural marketing has been encouraging for sure. But I think we should remember that there were strongly supported agrarian protests in the run-up to the 2019 elections. And when it came to it, there was strong support for Modi among cultivators, persuaded, no doubt, by his presentation of himself as the protector of India. For the time being, for sure, as I think both speakers have shown, the regime successfully provides cover for a path of economic development that fosters crony capitalism, continually deepens inequality, and denies the mass of the people anything more than the most basic livelihood. But to go back to the beginning of my remarks, I think it might prove surprisingly durable because of its foundation in Hindu nationalism. Though, of course, I know very well that it's not a majority of the people who are, as it were, paid up supporters of Hindutva convinced by Hindu nationalism. But it is bolstered by an extraordinarily powerful organization or set of organizations in the RSS and the so-called Sangh Parivar. And I think these are very, very durable foundations. Of course, there are major differences that Pranab referred to at the end of his remarks. And somebody like me who, as it were, well, I don't come from the south of India, but that's the part of the country that I know best. You know, I see it as very, very different from, it is very different from the Hindi heartland. But the possibilities for the southern states to really to challenge the power of Hindutva, of the Hindu, of Hindutva, and of the Hindi language across that great sort of swathe of the Hindi heartland. Well, I don't quite see how that's going to work out. Thanks very much. That's me done.
Thank you very much, Professor Harris. So now I suppose we can turn to some questions. So if you'd like to raise your digital hand, I will call on you to unmute yourself. We can also take questions from members of our own center. So yeah, so just raise your digital hand if you'd like to ask a question to any of the three panelists. Okay, Harry, do you want to go ahead?
Sure, thank you. This has been really impressive analysis on the part of all three of our speakers. I very much enjoyed listening to it. A couple of questions. We tend to think of the media and the courts as the essential guardrails of democracy. Neither one has been showing itself off very well lately. The media kind of reminds one of the emergency in a way, excessive timidity. The courts seem to be becoming more compliant. Professor Ghosh mentioned the wire, maybe an exception, but the general tendency is rather different. And Professor Bardhan mentioned the courts. Well, what's going on here? Is there any hope on either of these sectors? I'd like to hear your opinions on that. Thanks.
Thanks a lot. Irene Pang, do you want to ask your questions? We'll collect them and then everyone can discuss them.
Hello, I don't seem to be able to turn on my video, or I can try again.
There you go. Great.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all the panelists. This was a fascinating conversation. I wanted to go back to one of the contradictions that Professor Ghosh identified, which is the material hollowness of these aspirational narratives. Your argument there was that, you know, this is a contradiction that will have to play itself out, and you're optimistic that there will be resistance ultimately because the material conditions don't hold up. I wanted to ask a perhaps provocative question. I wonder to what extent democracy in its very flawed form in India, in all the ways that Professor Harris has described it, actually allows authoritarianism to continue in India, in the sense that, you know, at each election, and, you know, there's always an election happening in India. If people are disgruntled about the material conditions under which they're living, they can vote somebody else in. And it is unlikely, given the structural conditions that the new people voted in are going to be able to change the material conditions very much. And then it swings back again. And so, yeah, I guess the question that I have is, to what extent does democracy in its very flawed form, allow authoritarianism to continue to play out in India? Thanks.
Thanks so much, Irene. Last, we'll take this question from Sindhu, and then we can do another round.
Hello, thank you. That was a fascinating conversation, I think. The question I had was actually for Professor Ghosh about the contradiction that she was talking about. What is it something to do with like how, there's sort of this amnesia that happens in India, like people just forget all the horrible things that happened, and, they just vote for the same people again. Like even with the COVID thing, what, one of the panelists mentioned how it was such a horrible thing what happened in the second wave, but then Modi talks about it like it was, India did so well. And the fact that people actually sort of seem to have forgotten about what happened in the second COVID wave, right? So I was wondering whether it's something to do with this sort of, we sort of have this short-term memory, or how is it that, it keeps sort of coming back to, looking at this authoritarian government as a good thing for India. So thank you.
Thanks so much. Okay, so let's maybe any of the speakers want to start tackling those questions, and then we'll go to Vinayak and Sanjay in the next round.
I could begin if that's all right.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you so much. Let me begin with Irene's question about, does democracy allow authoritarianism? It's very complicated. I think the way you were saying it is that it doesn't matter whom you vote out because the next lot is going to do the same. It's not entirely true, or at least there are very strong regional differences in this. So that, for example, you find that the southern state of Tamil Nadu, where there was a very strong Dravidian movement, which has played out in terms of these two Dravidian parties that are in control, actually has seen a dramatic improvement in health indicators and education indicators. And John will know this better than me, but public schooling in Tamil Nadu has improved very, very sharply. With public spending, public health facilities have improved, and all the health outcome indicators went up, hugely. Kerala, of course, a completely different ballgame with all of the different social policies. But Sikkim, for example, dramatic improvement in many of these indicators. Himachal Pradesh, dramatic improvement. So it's a very mixed picture. It's not entirely always the same. And so I don't think it's democracy per se that allows totalitarianism, but I think it's the specific form it has taken in certain parts of the country where I take John's point, there's this very strong and deep Hindu nationalism, which frankly, I don't think it goes back centuries. No, John, I think it was created by this wretched RSS over decades of hard work. I think that's where we have to take our cue from the right wing. You have to be in it for the long game. You have to actually be there on the ground for many, many years before you can have an impact. So I think, yeah, that it is there, especially in large parts of the Hindi belt. And let's face it, the poison has also entered society in many ways, so that those features of identity, which were relatively less important, at least when confronted with the deeper material concerns that everybody faces, those have become, in a sense, predominant and can possibly even determine, all these electoral outcomes and so on. But I'm not willing to give up entirely on even electoral democracy in India. Let me put it that way. Yeah. But Sindhu, yeah, okay. Having said that, I swear I do not know anymore what voters are thinking. It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable to me the way in which voters have responded, or people. It's also, let's face it, mainstream media interviews disproportionately people who are part of it turns out, I think Alt News, the fact-checking site, they did a check on all the mainstream media's interviewees, and it turns out that 95% of them are members of the ruling party. So not surprising that, these young men are coming in saying all these things that they want to hear, and so on. So Maybe there is amnesia, maybe there isn't. I don't know. We'll find out if they allow it, if the election commission allows reasonably fair elections, if the EVMs aren't tampered with, if all kinds of other things don't happen. I'm not so convinced that voters have forgotten everything, that the bodies in the Ganga or the, having the terrible, terrible conditions that they had to go through. I don't think voters have forgotten all that. But I mean, really, it's true. We don't know anymore what voters think. Finally, on the media and the courts, the media has been terrorized at one level and suborned on the other. And of course, government advertisements is now the critical thing. You cannot function. Others are not allowed to give you advertising money, and governments give advertising money only to favored people and favored media houses. And so they all conform, except for, as I said, these brave little. Having said that, there are some. Prabhat Khabar in Uttar Pradesh, which they tried to close down, which the Bisht government, I cannot call him Yogi, tried to close down. The courts, I think we underestimate the extent to which the Judge Loya episode. Judge Loya was a judge of the High Court who was hearing a case in which Amit Shah was a defendant, and everything suggested that he was going to give a ruling that could possibly be unfavorable. He had expressed concerns about his own security to his family. He died in very suspicious circumstances, ostensibly of a heart attack in a guest house when he was on his way somewhere. And the whole thing is very murky. Only very few media houses, Caravan once again, have even dared to investigate it at all. But that investigation suggests something very scary. However, while the general public has not learnt of this, you can bet the judiciary has. The judiciary has got that message very, very clearly, that if you give unwelcome judgments, it's not just that you won't get transferred or you won't get promoted and all that, you could actually die. And I think that we can see a watershed. I do see the Judge Loya death as a watershed.
Great. Professor Bardhan or Professor Harris, if you want to speak. Professor Bardhan, yeah, there you go.
Okay. Yeah, just a few points, including I have some reaction to John Harris's questions, comments as well. But let me first take the question about Harry Blair, about the media and judiciary. I think Jayati has already responded to some. Let me just add that India being a very young country, the median age is what, about 26 now? The usual media that you and I read or watch is not the relevant media anymore. Most young people in the 20s and early 30s don't read newspapers or don't even watch TV. It's social media. And as I already mentioned, social media is dominated by, for reasons that I've also mentioned, dominated by the right wing. And so they have a built-in advantage, but even there are differences. In fact, I would say, I compare in my book that I mentioned, I also compare India with two developing countries, Brazil and Turkey, both ruled by right-wing authoritarians. Brazilian media and Brazilian judiciary have been much more active, much less timid than India's. Even though Bolsonaro is no better than Modi. The other issue is judiciary is kind of erratic sometimes, but even simple habeas corpus cases, they have so far delayed for years to take up. So I'm sure the kind of intimidation they fear is probably quite relevant there. Ask about the democracy question. I'm going to combine that with something that John started with. Is India a democracy anymore? longest democracies in the title of this of our session today. There, I think I've thought about this a little bit. And if you, in the political science literature, there are different definitions of democracy. In fact, some important scholars of democracy, like my friend Adam Zaborski, he would regard India very much a democracy, because his definition is what is called the minimalist definition.
Mm-hmm.
That is, in the next election, is there a chance that the incumbent can lose? As long as there is a significant chance, then that country, by the minimalist definition, is democratic. And since right now, in the 5 state elections, we're not absolutely sure that Modi is going to win all of them, although he announced last week that he's going to win all of them. So as long as there is some contestability and some chance of the incumbent losing, which even with all the media, all the money and the election commission doings, etc., minimalist definition, India is a democracy, but I don't myself follow that minimalist definition, because I think what is going on about the minimum rights, human rights, etc., are very important to me. But I think by some definition, India continues to be a democracy. One issue that John mentioned, and this also came up much more in the other interventions, the deepness, the depth of the Hindu nationalism in India. And I think, yes, it in fact goes back to 100 years. This year or the next year is the RSS centenary. Establishment. Now, yes, Hindu nationalism is quite deep. However, and this is what I was implying about the regional resilience, is that Hindu nationalism is identified with one of their slogans, which is Hindi, Hindu, Hindustan. Now, Hindi, Hindu, Hindustan slogan does not quite work in the South. It does not quite work in the East. And so that is a block there, but even there, as I already mentioned, Assam, Karnataka, East and South, they have won. So they always find local issues. Karnataka, for example, BJP, even though it's a Hindu nationalist party, is actually a dominant one-caste party, which is the Lingayats. So you carry out this clever, tactical caste alliances, which mainly Amit Shah's specialty. Through that, you work out some kind of arrangement. How long, one doesn't know. But so there are some blocks, and that is the only hope in some sense to block even this deep Hindu nationalism that BJP draws upon. There's another issue that I want to, there are 2 other issues that I want to mention relating to John's comments. One, and this is something that's come up in all the talks so far, is the horrible employment situation, and if anything, it's probably going to get worse. And in a sense, in fact, I've written about this. I called it the ticking time bomb of India. The 2 comments on that I want to make. One is that so far, the record of the other parties are also not that great on the issue of very few parties can claim real achievement, because the employment problem has been it's much worse now, but it's been going on since employment data is collected. Employment data has been collected since 1972, the National Sample Survey. It's been going down. It's either sluggish or going down, except for very short periods. And the record of the other parties is not that great. So therefore, BJP can always show, what have you done? And so on. That can be convincing. The other thing is, yes, if we relate authoritarianism of today to the horrible employment situation, I sometimes, and this is the pessimist in me, sometimes ask the question, can it not get us to a worse authoritarianism? One can think of authoritarianism even worse than Modi's. So my fear is that the time bomb can give us even something worse. It's not necessarily for the kind of things that you and I would like to have in India in terms of employment.
Yeah.
And the other parties do not have, I would say, a viable program. I mean, they're rhetorical, we'll do this, we'll do that. The rural job guarantee is not a solution, it's a relief program. So what is the long-term employment, non-rhetorical, that actually will carry out in a context of capitalism and crony capitalism as at that? I don't think it's clear. Most of the other parties have provided a much clear, convincing, beyond rhetoric, convincing agenda in some sense. So let me stop there.
Thanks so much. I think maybe let's just take this last round of questions. And we have about just less than 15 minutes left until 3 o'clock here in California. So let's try to keep it short. So Vinayak, can we turn to you?
Hi, my video is not turning on. It says the host has stopped it.
Let's see. Well,
I can ask the question.
anyways, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all to the speakers. I had a couple of questions, one for Professor Ghosh and the other for Professor Bardhan and John. Professor Ghosh, you know, you had were discussing the support of Indian capital for the BJP, but this last week there's been a video that's been circulating after the death of Rahul Bajaj, the billionaire, at a conference where he stood up and said to Amit Shah that I will say something that no other industrialist in the room will want to say. It was a room of Indian capitalists that we are all afraid, we are all scared. And it sort of struck me as I was listening to you, you know, I just wanted to get your impressions on that statement and in relation to the comments that you were making about Indian capital and its kind of alliances with the BJP. My second question was for Professor Bardhan and John regarding the nature of authoritarianism. I mean, more recently, the head of National Security Agency in India sort of declared to a room full of police officers or police trainees that the next target next target in terms of thinking about who's the internal enemy of India is civil society in India. And also in relation to the Pegasus scandal and the issue of cybersecurity. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that in relation to your comments about the changing nature of authoritarianism.
Thank you so much. Let's go to Sanjay for your question.
Thanks. Thank you to all of you for a very rich panel. Sorry, my printer is about to print here. I want to play devil's advocate, if I can put it concisely. So all of your analyses about the deficits of India's political economy are incredibly well taken. But I was wondering to what extent, to understand what's happened in India in the last decade, we need to focus on more political and contingent factors, which you've all talked about as well. You know, I'm very struck in the 1980s is the beginning of the rise of the BJP again, from a low of 2 seats and then upward crescendo till they hit 180 seats. And the 80s were, by various accounts, a better decade for the economy than before. And so it's, you know, I was thinking what John was saying, and you've all spoken about this. It's really not even just the ideology, but it's the powerful organizational apparatus of the BJP in a landscape where the opposition is highly fragmented. It still only received 37% of the vote in 2019. It's been losing state elections since 2017. And yet it not only dominates India, but as Suhas Palshikar, using Gramscian language, says, it's hegemonic. And I think that those more political, organizational, sociological factors, not to discount the importance of the political economy analysis you've given, because it's so desperate, but it seems to me that that is where its resilience lies, and to topple it is to focus on the opposition. And even the courts, the media, they all actually became much more powerful in the long coalition era, but precisely because they were never tested. They never faced a majoritarian government with a majoritarian ideology. So I was wondering if you could, what you thought of that. It's not to discount the importance of anything you said, but I just wonder to what extent it's really the politics, the sociology, the organizational aspect, and the ideological aspects that are really driving this, and also are also that, in a sense, to combat the BJP is to focus on that. I mean, in the sense, Jyoti said that, you know, they're more Gramscian than than anyone in the left in India, and that's the kind of work that has to be done. And I agree with Jyoti that the surprises, 1977, 2004, and you could say in some senses 2014. I don't think anybody expected Modi to win the majority he did in 2014. Those surprises, I still have hope that Indian elections, as flawed as they are, can really, they have surprised us at pivotal moments, and could do again.
Thank you so much for that great question. Let's go to Huma and then to Lex.
Yes, thank you so much. I won't be able to turn my video on because
That's okay.
the Wi-Fi is a bit weak. But I wanted to thank all three presenters. And my question is, should we not be looking at a democracy, authoritarian or otherwise, from the position of the most vulnerable, of the weakest, rather than the billionaires, rather than even the middle class? And in my case, I want your thoughts, your opinions about the coloniality that India has been flexing ever since 1947, despite being a post-colonial entity itself within Kashmir. And as of 5th August 2019, a very explicit annexation. And I am dumbfounded when I don't find that being mentioned as one of the foundational ills of the quote unquote democracy of India. And within that is covered the legislative aspects of the Indian state, the judicial aspects. I mean, the Supreme Court has yet to conduct a hearing on the abrogation, the derogation of Article 370 and 35A. The Supreme Court is the exact entity that sent Afzal Guru to the gallows. Just 5 days ago, we're marking the 9th death anniversary. So any thought? I mean, and I'm pointing this out because it's precisely from the perspective of Muslims, from Kashmiris, that you will see that democracy is such a laughable label, despite the spectacle of the elections that is held so regularly. Thank you for that.
Thanks so much. And let's quickly do the last question from Lex.
Hi there, everyone. First of all, just a big thank you to all the speakers. This has been really fantastic so far. My question is relatively straightforward. As Professor Bardhan mentioned towards the start, it seems the trade union movement in India is rather small and hasn't exerted much of an influence recently. I'm curious to what extent this is a product of conditions external to the trade movement and potentially missteps of the trade movement itself. And I'm curious towards what the current trade movement as it stands is oriented to, whether or not it's pursuing a politics of antagonism against Modi and actively attempting to organize itself larger, or if it is simply content to be a sort of a business unionism model as we've seen elsewhere in the world for a number of decades. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. Okay, so maybe all three panelists can speak in whatever capacity they would like to on these questions. So who would like to go first? Maybe
Others and
sure.
coming forward. I can start. Okay, let me start at the first one was about the civil society as declared as enemy in that speech. I can only say that there have been a lot of comments on that made. I agree with most of these comments, but see, that was just a candid statement there. This is a policy that this government has been following for quite some time. Civil society is the enemy, and they have been essentially made it very difficult for many NGO, the organizations to operate. If you try to be an NGO, the money from abroad is a problem. Then the number of formalities you have to go through, the number of hoops you have to go through, made it very difficult for civil society to really operate, because they know much of civil society is critical of them. And so, like quashing all criticism, they're also trying to do this, which is very interesting. Main law by which they hit civil society is the FCRA, the foreign fund thing. But this is a law which I don't know how many of you know exempts political parties. Now, I've often wondered, what is a political party? Political party is not subject to right to information. Why? Because right to information applies only to public entities, and political party is not a public entity. If it's not a public entity, it must be a private entity. Then it must be an NGO. But political parties don't have FCRA applied to them. It's exempt from FCRA. So all the money that goes from the United States and Britain, BJP, it's exempt from FCRA. So this is a policy right away. This Mr. Doval's speech is only just a latest, somewhat candid statement of it. Sanjay's comments, in fact, I agree, and I think my presentation was focused more on the social, political, organizational, rather than the economic, even though I'm an economist. Let me say that, yes, I think BJP has, when I said they control the narrative, they in a sense have succeeded in this, what Suhas Palsikar is calling hegemonic. They have succeeded in this in large parts of India, not in all parts of India. That in fact, when I mentioned in my initial presentation about other parties are now afraid to be branded as pro-Muslim, so they don't say anything, is largely because the hegemonic influence that BJP narrative of Hindutva. So that's very clear. About the, Sanjay referred to 37% which Modi got in 2019. Actually, it's more than 37%. NDA got 44%. BJP got 37%. But that NDA is no longer fully there in Maharashtra and Punjab. But still, it's much larger than 37%. In India, first past the post, you don't really need that much more. If you can manage 40%. So BJP's political arithmetic is clear. They know, and this is electorally, election studies show it, they know they get about 2/3 of the upper caste vote. They get about 45% of the backward caste vote. So they have worked out, if they can persuade the Dalits and the tribals that on the Hindu consolidation or the hegemonic thing that we talked about before, they need about 1/3. And that is doable. In the first post system, if you have 1/3 of the Dalit and tribal vote, you have about 40-45% of OBC vote, and you 66% of the upper caste vote, political arithmetic gives you pass the post. And that's what they are calculating. And Amit Shah's clever crafting of these tactical alliances, caste, sub-caste alliances, are precisely for that, to achieve that arithmetic goal. On the issue of, and as I mentioned in my presentation toward the end, the main problem is the regional problems. And already we've talked about the South and the East. But even there, in the 1990 to 2010, these 2 decades were the decades when the regional parties became very important. Now, but the thing is, during this period in the coalition governments, the regional parties exercised a lot of weight. But what they did not do, they did not institutionalize this power of the regional parties. They did not do any, so it was very easy for Modi coming in 2014 to dismantle those earlier arrangements, because the arrangements were kind of transactional, negotiatory arrangement, not institutionals. By institutionals, for example, today, even if a chief minister has a lot of things to say, there's no forum for the chief minister, for him or her to say it. Earlier, at least in the planning commission meeting, they used to say their things, but there's no forum. There is an interstate coordinate, interstate council, which exists, but nobody pays any attention to them. Similarly, now there's a GST council where the states can present their economic cases, but those things, those institutionally have been hijacked. So I think we need institutionalization of regional regional power. It's difficult to do now, but it is the only way to go. On the issue of that Madhur mentioned, I entirely agree. I think Indian democracy, when we talk about Indian democracy so far, it's been excluding Kashmir and excluding parts of Northeast and excluding parts of the jungles of central India. We don't talk about them. And in a sense, what India has done to Kashmir, the rest of India will slowly watch it happen in India. I have no doubt about that. But the reason why still India is called a democracy, as I mentioned in my earlier intervention, by some minimalist definition, if there is a chance that the BJP might lose, then some political scientists call that a democracy because there is a chance incumbent may lose. So it's in that very limited sense, India is still a democracy. Last question from Lex was on trade unions. Trade unions have got weaker all over the world. There are many reasons, technological, because of the automation technology and the artificial intelligence, etc. There is globalization. When capital can threaten to move somewhere else, labor is at a low bargaining power. So trade unions have become much weaker. Indian cases, of course, is very special because Indian trade unions represent a tiny island of the labor force, the formal sector largely. And major problem of Indian trade unions do not do much for the informal sector. So the informals, who appeals to the informal sector becomes very important. So you appeal to the informal workers in other ways. And Modi is now appealing to informal workers through those gifts of his, with his photographs. So the trade unions in some sense do not work in the informal sector. And unless they do that, it would be difficult for them to be even at the low level of efficacy that trade unions are elsewhere. In India, it doesn't have that. BJP also has, and the other thing is in India, the organizations is there. Whichever country is in power in Delhi is the major trade union. I've always noticed this with great, sadness, that when Congress is in power, INTUC is the biggest union. Now, which is the biggest union is Bharatiya Mazdoor Sangh, which is the BJP union. So that tells you something about the way trade union leadership is organized in India. The leading party has the leading trade union. And that, I think that I can say a lot of things about that, but let me stop there.
Thanks so much, Professor Bardhan. Who would like to go next?
I'd like Jayati to come in. I'd just like to say one thing.
Please.
I think I can say it very briefly. I said something about ceasing to refer to India as the world's most populous democracy, and Pranab has come back on that, and I entirely accept what has been said. But my reason for wanting to question the continuing parroting of the largest democracy and so on is because I think we are not in North America, in Britain, are not recognizing sufficiently the extent of human rights abuses in India today. All that stuff about the Uyghurs and terrible things happening in China, but we hear so little about the terrible things that are happening to Muslims, to Dalits, to Kashmiris, to so many other groups of people in India. So that's why I want to question this continuing parroting of the greatest democracy. Thus, enough. Jayati.
Thank you very much. And I have only a couple of footnotes really to add to those excellent responses. On the issue of the trade union movement, I also want to just mention that, the way things have panned out, and it's neoliberalism everywhere, all the trade unions really focus on public sector employers because they're not allowed to function. The regulatory structures have been so weakened for any kind of trade union rights that it's almost impossible for unions to be organized in private employers, including in the top private companies. It's very, very difficult to organize. So most of the trade unions, including the BMS and all the others that were mentioned, all of them really operate vis-a-vis public sector enterprises or the government. And in that, they also include informal workers. In fact, the only growth in trade union membership, it now constitutes, I think, almost half of the membership of the CITU, the Marxist Party's trade union, is of informal workers, but for the government. So the Indian government has this extraordinary system of so-called voluntary workers or scheme workers, whom they don't even pay the minimum wage, mostly women in health and primary education sectors. So Anganwadi workers, Ashas, the accredited social health activists, they're called, etc. All of them, they are being organized by trade unions. They are informal workers. As I said, they don't even get minimum wage. And there has been some movement, but it's all vis-a-vis public employment because it's almost impossible now to actually organize in private enterprises. Having said that, in the last 5 months, there have been 2 very major strikes. 2 of them were the largest strikes in the period since the emergency. So we are talking about what? The largest strikes in 40 years. They got no media attention. There was absolutely zero coverage, but they were very extensive, and they were present in about 11 states, which I think is quite impressive. So yes, there is a rumbling underneath. I don't think we can write off the trade union movement, even in its very, very weakened and patriarchal and etc. state. There is still a trade union movement. A lot of it is directed entirely to public employment, but there are more and more women in it, which I think is a good thing. And there are more informal workers in it as well of this type. On the issue, Ruma, I completely agree with you that there is a fundamental problem with the way in which we talk about democracy. And there, I think, John, it's not just what's happened recently. There have been these deeply undemocratic positions of the Indian state well before the BJP came to power, vis-a-vis Kashmir, vis-a-vis Adivasis in different parts of the country, vis-a-vis the Northeast, and the continuing regulations on, I mean, the ability of the Armed Forces Special Powers Act to be pursued in parts of the country which are seen as volatile and fragile, where human rights are not respected at all. Having said that, yes, I also agree with John that, it's really not taken seriously enough, the extent of human rights violations in India, the extent to which there's been such a backsliding in terms of basic rights of people, and the kinds of extreme repression. It's not just suppression, it's extreme repression of anyone who dissents in any form. And I think some of that is because, China, etc., but it's also because India is seen as this geopolitical bulwark against China, and therefore the elite in the US and Europe are not interested in raising all these specters of authoritarianism in India, because it suits them to have India as an ally in the broader geopolitical issue. Rahul Bajaj Vinayak asked this question. Yes, absolutely. But in fact, Rahul Bajaj, somebody mentioned this, I think, in one of the obituaries. It was not just that he was one of the few. He was not one of the few. He was the only one. He was the only big industrialist who dared open his mouth. And he opened quite often, displaying, I think, remarkable courage, which is to say, yes, he was right that, in fact, many of them are afraid. So when I was talking about big capital being behind Modi, I didn't say all big capital, but some, the big cronies. And the big cronies have got more and more and more powerful. They're eating up in, even other big capital at this point. So it is those big cronies who are completely behind Modi and who have got even greater financial power, economic power, market power than they had before. They are the ones very much behind Modi. And I think and they also control media houses. They're pretty much, controlling a wide range of industries and activities. So that I think is the point really. And finally, just want to say, I actually agree strongly with Sanjay about the powerful organizational apparatus of the Sangh Parivar, which extends beyond the party. It covers cultural organizations, women's organizations, students' organizations, schools, cultural activities, you name it. They have covered all the bases. And they have been doing that, burrowing along for decades. So I repeat that, the one thing we really have to learn from the right is that long vision and being on the ground and burrowing along for a long period, because that's the only way you can confront that. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. If our speakers don't have anything else to add, maybe we can close here. So I really want to thank everyone. I want to thank the speakers, Professor Bardhan, Professor Ghosh, and Professor Harris, for their fantastic presentations and remarks. It's really been an honor to listen to them, and I'm glad that we could do this event together. Alas, online, but better online than not at all. And yeah, so I will put, if you all want to keep informed of events by the center, I'm putting in the link to our website and to the mailing list, so you can sign up there. You can also, check out the website for past events, recordings of past events. So we have recordings on our events in China and the Middle East. And in 2 weeks, as Professor Brenner had mentioned, we'll be having one on Latin America and Southeast Asia in a comparative fashion. So anyways, thanks again. And please, take time to, virtually clap your hands, I suppose, for our speakers. And thanks again.